Illness, when viewed through the lens of spiritual science, cannot be understood as a merely accidental disturbance of an otherwise healthy organism, nor as a purely mechanical failure of bodily processes. It must be grasped as an event within the total biography of the human being, an event that arises from the interaction of body, soul, and spirit across time, including the time that extends beyond a single earthly life. To approach illness in this way requires a fundamental shift in perception, from asking only what has broken down to asking what has sought expression through the breakdown. The human being is not born as a blank physical organism into which life simply enters. Rather, before conception and birth, the individuality passes through a long existence within the spiritual worlds. There, between death and a new birth, the human being works together with higher spiritual beings on the formation of the forces that will later shape the physical body. What later appears as the constitution, as predisposition toward strength or weakness in certain organs or systems, is already prepared in this pre-earthly existence. Illness, therefore, often has its deepest roots not in the present life alone, but in the manner in which the individuality has woven its destiny across incarnations. This does not mean that illness should be regarded as a punishment for earlier deeds, nor as something to be passively accepted. Such a moralistic interpretation would be a profound misunderstanding. Spiritual science shows that karma is not a system of reward and punishment, but a lawful striving toward balance. Illness can arise where forces carried over from earlier lives encounter resistance in the present incarnation. It may be that capacities once developed too one-sidedly now seek correction, or that experiences previously avoided must now be met in a more concrete, bodily form. The physical body itself is not a purely physical entity. It is the expression, the densest condensation of formative forces that belong to the etheric and astral realms. Health arises when the etheric body can permeate the physical body harmoniously, shaping it according to life laws, while the astral body enters and withdraws rhythmically, allowing both vitality and consciousness to unfold. Illness appears when this harmony is disturbed, when the astral body presses too strongly into the physical, or when it withdraws too much, when the etheric forces become either too rigid or too weak to maintain organic form. Many inflammatory illnesses, for example, can be understood as expressions of an overactive astral body, which grips the physical organism too intensely. The warmth processes become exaggerated, metabolism becomes turbulent, and the organism reacts as if under inner attack. Other illnesses, especially degenerative conditions, point in the opposite direction. The astral body and I withdraw too far, leaving the etheric and physical bodies to harden, mineralize, or decay, without sufficient inner guidance. In both cases, illness reveals a disturbed relationship between the higher members of the human being and the bodily instrument. Yet this disturbance does not arise arbitrarily. It is often connected with the soul life, with unresolved emotions, untransformed experiences, or habitual attitudes carried through long stretches of time. Thoughts and feelings are not fleeting shadows. They are real forces that work into the etheric organization. Persistent fear, suppressed anger, or rigid patterns of thinking can, over years or even lifetimes, shape tendencies toward particular forms of illness. The body remembers what consciousness has forgotten. At the same time, spiritual science warns against simplistic one-to-one interpretations. One cannot say that a specific thought or moral failing causes a specific disease in a direct manner. The human being is far too complex for such reductions. Illness arises out of a whole constellation of factors: karmic history, soul constitution, earthly circumstances, and the activity of spiritual beings who accompany human evolution. What matters is not to label illness, but to read it as a meaningful gesture within the biography. From this perspective, healing also gains a deeper significance. Healing is not merely the removal of symptoms, but the restoration of harmony between the human being's members. Sometimes, true healing consists in overcoming the illness physically. Sometimes it consists in integrating its meaning into the life of the soul, even if physical recovery is incomplete. There are illnesses whose task is fulfilled not by cure, but by transformation of consciousness. In such cases, the illness has served as a teacher, compelling the eye to awaken to dimensions of life previously ignored. Modern medicine, with its immense technical achievements, addresses illness primarily from the physical side. Spiritual science does not oppose this, but seeks to complement it by revealing the deeper layers of causation. Only when the human being is approached as a being of body, soul, and spirit can illness be understood in its full reality. In this sense, illness is not an enemy to be fought blindly, but a messenger whose language must be learned. In the next step of this consideration, it becomes necessary to look more closely at the role of karma and destiny in shaping specific illness patterns across incarnations, and at how the human eye actively participates, often unconsciously, in the formation of disease. When we deepen our consideration of illness from a spiritual scientific point of view, the role of karma comes into clearer focus. Karma is not an abstract principle hovering over human life. It is the concrete continuation of human willing, feeling, and thinking beyond the boundaries of a single incarnation. Illness often arises where karmic threads, woven in earlier earthly lives and in the life between death and rebirth, intersect with the conditions of the present embodiment. The body becomes the stage upon which unresolved tendencies seek expression and transformation. Between death and a new birth, the human being does not simply rest in a vague spiritual bliss. Rather, the individuality reviews the past life in collaboration with spiritual beings and participates actively in shaping the conditions of the next incarnation. In this process, the future physical body is prepared as an instrument suited to the tasks the soul has set itself. Certain weaknesses or vulnerabilities may be intentionally incorporated not as punishments, but as opportunities. Illness can thus be understood as something that the individuality has, in a certain sense, agreed to take upon itself, because it offers a possibility for inner development that could not be achieved otherwise. This idea is difficult for modern consciousness to accept, because it contradicts the prevailing notion that health is an absolute good and illness an absolute evil. Spiritual science does not deny the suffering caused by illness, nor does it romanticize disease. It recognizes suffering as real and serious. Yet it also sees that suffering can become meaningful when it is integrated into the conscious life of the I. The decisive question is not why illness occurs in a general sense, but how the human being relates to it inwardly. Illness often confronts the I with limits. It interrupts habitual patterns, forces withdrawal from outer activity, and compels attention toward the inner life. In many cases, the I has previously identified itself too strongly with external success, social roles, or purely intellectual activity. Illness then acts as a counterforce, drawing consciousness back toward neglected dimensions of existence. This does not mean that every illness must be interpreted psychologically or morally, but it does mean that illness frequently has the character of a biographical turning point. From a spiritual point of view, the astral body plays a central role in this process. The astral body carries not only emotions and desires, but also the imprints of earlier incarnations. When these imprints are not fully harmonized with the present life situation, tensions arise. These tensions can remain at the soul level for a long time, appearing as moods, recurring emotional patterns, or inner restlessness. If they are not transformed through conscious inner work, they may gradually descend into the etheric and physical bodies where they manifest as illness. This descent is not sudden. It is a slow process, often spanning years or decades. The etheric body, which governs growth, regeneration, and life rhythms, is particularly sensitive to long-standing soul attitudes. When the etheric body is burdened by disharmonious astral influences, its formative forces weaken or become distorted. The physical body then follows, expressing in matter what has long existed as an imbalance in the supersensible members. In this sense, illness is often the final stage of a process that began far earlier on a non-physical level. The I is not merely a passive victim in this process. Even when illness has deep karmic roots, the I retains freedom in how it responds. This response is itself karmically significant. Two individuals with similar illnesses may develop in entirely different directions depending on whether they meet their condition with bitterness, resignation, reflection, or inner resolve. The illness does not determine the outcome. It creates a field of possibility within which freedom can be exercised in a new way. It is also important to recognize that not all illnesses originate primarily in personal karma. Some arise from what may be called community karma, or even humanity karma. Epidemics, widespread nervous disorders, and certain chronic conditions reflect imbalances in collective life, in social structures, cultural rhythms, and shared modes of thinking. In such cases, the individual illness cannot be fully understood without reference to the spiritual condition of the time. The human being bears not only personal destiny, but also a share of the destiny of the community and epoch into which they are born. Here, the activity of spiritual beings again comes into view. The hierarchies guide not only individual biographies, but also the evolution of humanity as a whole. Certain illness patterns appear historically when new stages of consciousness are being prepared. The increasing prevalence of nervous and mental illnesses, for example, is connected with the growing dominance of intellectual consciousness and the weakening of instinctive life. Illness thus mirrors evolutionary processes that are both necessary and perilous. Healing, from this perspective, cannot be reduced to technical intervention alone. True healing involves helping the I regain a living relationship to its bodily instrument. This may occur through medical treatment, but also through changes in life orientation, through artistic activity, through moral effort, or through a renewed relationship to meaning. Sometimes healing takes the form of recovery. Sometimes it takes the form of reconciliation with limitation. In both cases, the essential question is whether the human being emerges from illness more inwardly awake. In the next part, we will look more closely at the specific relationship between illness and the fourfold constitution of the human being, and at how different types of illness express disturbances between the physical, etheric, astral, and eye organizations. To understand illness more concretely, spiritual science directs attention to the fourfold constitution of the human being: physical body, etheric body, astral body, and eye organization. Illness never belongs exclusively to one of these members, yet it always reveals itself as a disturbance in their mutual relationship. Health exists when these members interpenetrate one another in the right way, each fulfilling its task without encroaching upon the domain of the others. Disease arises where this balance is lost, and one member gains an undue predominance or withdraws too far from its proper sphere of activity. The physical body, taken by itself, tends toward mineralization. Left entirely to its own laws, it would follow the path of decay. It is held in living form only through the continuous activity of the etheric body. Wherever the etheric forces weaken, the physical body begins to assert its own nature more strongly. Degenerative illnesses, sclerosis, and conditions marked by hardening or loss of vitality point toward such a weakening of etheric activity. In these cases, life forces are no longer able to permeate the physical substance sufficiently, and the organism begins to behave as if it were partially abandoned by life itself. The etheric body, however, is not an autonomous ruler. It must be shaped and guided by the astral body, which brings movement, sensitivity, and inner differentiation into the organism. The astral body is responsible for the rhythmic alternation between tension and release, between activity and rest. When the astral body presses too forcefully into the etheric and physical bodies, life processes become overheated, accelerated, or inflammatory. Fever, acute infections, and many inflammatory conditions express an astral body that is too intensely engaged with the bodily organism, driving processes beyond their healthy limits. On the other hand, when the astral body withdraws too strongly, the organism loses responsiveness. Sensation dulls, inner mobility decreases, and the etheric forces are left without sufficient guidance. Certain depressive states, exhaustion syndromes, and illnesses characterized by lethargy and lack of inner warmth can be understood in this light. The body then lacks the enlivening and differentiating impulses that normally flow from the astral organization. Above the astral body stands the eye organization, which gives the human being self-awareness, moral orientation, and the capacity to transform instinct into conscious intention. The eye works most directly through the warmth organization of the body. Wherever the eye can properly permeate the organism, warmth processes are regulated in a subtle and individualized way. Illness often indicates that the eye is either unable to enter fully into certain bodily regions or is forced to retreat from them. Chronic illnesses frequently point to long-standing difficulties of the eye in mastering specific bodily processes. From this perspective, illness can be seen as a kind of dialogue, sometimes a struggle, between the eye and its bodily instrument. In youth, the eye often works vigorously into the organism, sometimes at the cost of balance. Later in life, the eye may find it increasingly difficult to maintain its formative influence, and illness can appear where this influence falters. The life course itself thus shapes the character of illness, and age-related diseases reflect changing relationships between the higher and lower members of the human being. What is decisive here is that illness is not merely something that happens to the human being, but something that happens within the human being as a spiritual entity. Even when external factors such as infection, injury, or environmental conditions play a role, they become illness only when the inner constitution allows them to take hold. Two people may encounter the same external influence, yet only one becomes ill. The reason lies in the differing relationships between their bodily and spiritual members. This insight leads to a more nuanced understanding of vulnerability. Vulnerability is not weakness in a moral sense, but an expression of a particular karmic configuration. A person who is vulnerable in one area may possess exceptional strength in another. Illness often arises where sensitivity is greatest. Such sensitivity can be the basis for heightened perception, creativity, or moral depth. In this way, illness and gift are sometimes two sides of the same destiny. The question of incurable illness must also be approached from this standpoint. There are situations in which the spiritual individuality no longer fully takes hold of the physical organism. The connection between the eye and the bodily instrument loosens to such a degree that complete restoration is no longer possible. From a purely material point of view, this appears as failure. From a spiritual point of view, it may indicate that the essential work of this incarnation has shifted away from physical development toward inner preparation for the next stage of existence. This does not diminish the value of medical effort. On the contrary, every attempt to alleviate suffering and support life has meaning. Yet spiritual science adds another dimension. It invites us to see that the deepest healing does not always coincide with physical recovery. Sometimes the illness fulfills its task precisely by setting limits to outer activity, forcing the eye to turn inward and reorient itself toward what is essential. The human being thus stands within illness as within a threshold experience. Illness reveals how deeply the spiritual and bodily dimensions of existence are interwoven. It exposes imbalances that may have remained hidden in times of apparent health. To understand illness in this way does not remove its difficulty, but it gives it context and dignity. It allows the human being to encounter illness not only with fear or resistance, but also with a searching attentiveness. In the final part, we will consider how this understanding of illness leads to a transformed view of healing itself, and how true healing involves cooperation between medical intervention, soul development, and the guiding activity of spiritual beings within human destiny. When we turn finally to the question of healing, spiritual science leads us away from the idea that healing consists solely in the elimination of symptoms or the restoration of a previous state of physical functioning. Healing, in its deeper sense, is a process through which the human being is brought into a new and more conscious relationship with their own constitution. It is a reestablishment of harmony between the physical body, the etheric life forces, the astral soul forces, and the I. But this harmony does not necessarily replicate what existed before illness. Often it represents a new equilibrium, achieved through experience, suffering, and inner transformation. From this point of view, illness and healing belong together as phases of a single developmental process. Illness reveals an imbalance. Healing responds to it. Yet healing does not always mean that the imbalance disappears completely from the physical plane. There are cases in which the physical body cannot fully follow the inner reordering that has taken place in the higher members. In such instances, the healing occurs primarily at the level of the soul and spirit. The I gains strength, clarity, or moral resolve, even if the body remains marked by limitation. Spiritual science therefore distinguishes between cure and healing, without opposing them. Cure concerns the body. Healing concerns the whole human being. Medical treatment in this context has the task of supporting the etheric and physical bodies so that the I and astral body can once again work into them in a meaningful way. Remedies, therapies, and interventions are not merely chemical or mechanical aids. They are mediators between different levels of existence. A substance derived from the mineral, plant, or animal kingdoms carries within it specific formative forces. When such a substance is used therapeutically, it does not act only through physical causality, but through its relationship to etheric and astral processes. True therapy, therefore, seeks to match the nature of the remedy to the nature of the imbalance within the human being. At the same time, spiritual science emphasizes that no therapy can replace the inner activity of the I. The most effective treatment remains incomplete if the human being remains inwardly passive. Healing requires participation. This participation may take many forms: a conscious engagement with one's life situation, a transformation of habitual attitudes, a renewed sense of meaning, or the courage to face unresolved inner conflicts. Illness often weakens the illusion that life can be managed entirely through control. Healing begins where the human being learns to listen to what life is asking of them. This listening does not imply self-accusation or constant self-analysis. On the contrary, excessive introspection can itself become a source of imbalance. What is required is a quiet attentiveness, a willingness to let the experience of illness speak without immediately forcing it into preconceived explanations. In this space of attentiveness, the I can gradually discover how it is meant to work differently with its bodily instrument. Sometimes this discovery leads to concrete changes in lifestyle. Sometimes it leads to inner decisions that are invisible to the outer world but decisive for the future course of destiny. The activity of spiritual beings must also be considered here. Just as illness is connected with the working of karmic forces and the guidance of the hierarchies, so healing is not solely a human achievement. The angel being of the individual accompanies both illness and recovery, not by removing difficulties, but by helping the I find orientation within them. Higher hierarchies work more indirectly, shaping the broader conditions under which healing can occur. To recognize this does not mean surrendering responsibility, but acknowledging that human life is embedded in a larger spiritual order. In this sense, gratitude becomes a healing force in itself. Gratitude does not deny suffering, but it transforms the soul's relationship to it. Where gratitude arises, even gratitude for insight gained through difficulty, the astral body becomes more flexible, less resistant. This flexibility allows the etheric forces to work more freely, and the physical organism can respond more positively. Such inner gestures cannot be prescribed, but they can be cultivated. They arise where the human being no longer sees illness only as an interruption of life, but as a part of life's deeper schooling. The modern world, with its emphasis on efficiency and productivity, often leaves little room for this kind of understanding. Illness is seen as an error to be corrected as quickly as possible. Spiritual science does not reject the legitimate urgency of medical intervention, but it invites us to widen the horizon. It asks us to consider what kind of human beings we become through illness and healing, and how these experiences shape not only our present life, but our future incarnations. Ultimately, the spiritual meaning of illness can be grasped only by the individual who lives through it. No general theory can replace personal insight. Yet spiritual science offers a framework within which such insight can arise without falling into despair or superstition. It shows that illness, however painful, does not stand outside the meaningful order of the world. It belongs to the same evolutionary stream that leads the human being toward greater freedom, consciousness, and responsibility.